You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
What if Galaxy AI could turn your to-dos into to-das? Unlock everyday simplicity with the AI-integrated Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra at Best Buy. Pre-order now at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
EABLES. Ebles. Remember that name, because if you suffer from chronic joint and muscle pain like me, then Ebles Broad Spectrum CBD Oil is your answer to your prayers. The Ebles story began with the search for something natural to help manage chronic migraines. But Ebles helps more than just migraines. From managing chronic pain, anxiety, depression, and more, Ebles is truly a game changer in the natural alternatives to big pharma drugs. And yours truly, Brian Nichols, here on The Brian Nichols Show, can indeed vouch for the quality of Ebles. Having a herniated disc in my back, coupled with years of sports injuries, I was struggling to find something, anything, to help manage my pain. That is, until Ebles. With the best quality product and customer service in the industry, Ebles Broad Spectrum CBD Oil and Ebles Freeze Gel easily stand above all the competition. And right now, Ebles is offering a special discount to all members of the Brian Nichols Show audience on all orders. All you have to do is head to Ebles.com and use promo code TBNS, the Brian Nichols Show, right? TBNS at checkout. That's it. Discount applied. Again, the code is TBNS at checkout to start managing your pain today with the highest quality CBD on the market. One more time, that is code TBNS at checkout. And now, on to the show.
Can I pause for a second and just note that we got Brian on here who's getting Congressman Massey on, and our typical lineup includes like homeless people that believe in Bigfoot.
Welcome to the Brian Nichols Show, your source for common sense politics on the We Are Libertarians network. The Brian Nichols Show is the fastest growing liberty podcast that brings together people from all means of political thought as we seek to have meaningful conversations about the issues you care about. At the Brian Nichols Show, our goal is to leave the audience educated, enlightened, and informed. And now your host, Brian Nichols.
Well, hello there. I know, Saturday. You're like, Brian, what are you doing? It's Saturday. You never record on Saturday. And candidly, you're right. But I had an amazing conversation with one Nick Hudson, good friend of the show. We had him back on January 1st of 2021, just about 4 months ago, talking about, yes, these lockdowns and the implications of said lockdowns. Well, I just had Nick on the show, and we were going to air the show mid-April, but it just happened to coincide with an amazing new talk he actually just did, and it was The Ugly Truth About Lockdowns, and it was recorded on YouTube. It's going viral. It's going wild. So I said, you know what? Heck with delaying this conversation. We're going to go ahead and we're going to launch this episode today as a special bonus episode for you folks here at the Brian Nichols Show audience. So all I ask in return, please do me a favor, make sure you share today's episode. This is a super, super awesome episode, and really it digs into pretty much any question that you could possibly want to ask. Like, okay, Dr. Fauci, what do real epidemiologists and immunologists think of him? Let's talk about the variants. Are those actually causing a lot of problems right now? A lot of this stuff Nick Hudson digs into, so it's a really great chance to learn a lot. But first, what you need to do is make sure you go and watch the amazing video. It's, again, The Ugly Truth About Lockdowns. I'm including the link in the show notes, about 27 minutes or so, but it's well worth every single minute. Then come back here and strap in for a nice behind the scenes. So with that being said, on to the show. Nick Hudson here on The Brian Nichols Show.
Hello, Brian. Good to be back with you.
Nick, it's so great to have you back. We just had about, a half an hour conversation before we hit the magical record button, because there's so much that you've been doing behind the scenes, and not even just behind the scenes. Now we're getting out there and you're doing a nice blitz, and actually we're recording here on the 27th of March. You know, it's funny. This is going to be an episode a couple weeks from now. I'm an officiant in a really good buddy's wedding, and I was like, this is going to air sometime mid-April. And I'm like, no. This information, this topic, we're going to make this a special bonus episode, probably airing today or tomorrow, because you just had a brand new video go out on YouTube, Time to Reopen Society, or otherwise it was called The Ugly Truth About Lockdowns, which both are great names. And this is more of a behind the scenes for folks. So first, we need to make sure we're pointing folks towards this awesome YouTube video. We'll include the link in the show notes. Time to Reopen Society. Invest that like half an hour or so, and then come here, because this is going to be a great chance for folks to hear not just some more context, some more nuance, but also a little bit more in terms of what's been the reception, what's been the overall, I guess, the changing tenor that we're seeing, Nick. So how about this? The last time you were on the show, it was actually the 1st of January, and we're about 4 months removed from then. So a lot's changed since you were last on the show. Let's kind of fill the audience in. What has been going on in the past 4 months over at PANDA?
Well, we've continued, Brian, to try and build the organization's capacities to get the message out there. PANDA is, I think, unrivaled in the world in terms of the reach that it has. We have a really strong advisory board composed of some of the leading specialists in fields like infectious diseases and epidemiology. And then also we think it's very important to broaden. So we have people from, the fields of education and inside the organization itself. There 150 odd active members that include people from very diverse fields: pathology, actuarial science, economics, microbiology, and so on. And ecology. I found the ecologists are some of the best people to have on board in terms of understanding the epidemic. They really do see things in a big picture fashion, whereas a lot of these, especially epidemiologists, they've sort of learned how to solve a system of 3 differential equations and build an SIR model. That it's a very balkanized, narrow frame through which to view the world. And they want everybody else to go away. They don't want any other experts in their turf. And I think that's also, one of the things that has enabled the bad agents in this story to manipulate them to such a degree. And I really think it is about that. There are people here who have been driving towards a certain outcome, and it's particularly perverse. From country to country, from agency to agency. I mean, if you look at the World Health Organization, if you look at the CDC, we had in place very clear and detailed guidelines for what you should do if you're struck by a respiratory virus pandemic. And within the space of a few weeks, even a few days, probably that's more accurate way of describing it, but within the space of a few days, those guidelines were torn up. In the process, in some cases, there were actually rules in place for what you had to do in terms of evidentiary proof to change those guidelines, let alone to tear them up. And those rules were torn up. So we had this crazy situation where a completely untested set of response measures suddenly was implemented around the world, despite the fact that they completely contradicted everything that we knew about viral pandemics. And the very disturbing thing is when you can go and look at those guidelines, you can see that they're there, and that's presumably what the organizations were ready for, because they'd updated them as recently, in the case of the World Health Organization, as October 2019. But at almost the same time, you've got these kind of parallel organizations like Johns Hopkins University and the Gates Foundation holding mock pandemic preparedness exercises that completely contradicted everything in the guidelines. So they've got their own idea about what should happen if there's a viral outbreak. And that version of the story, untested by science or scientists, is what was rolled out on us. And it happened very quickly.
That's wild.
With the help of a lot of propaganda, a lot of behavioral psychology being implemented, a lot of manipulation of social media. You've got these big tech and big pharma companies exercising a degree of control over the media narrative that is without precedent in the history of Western democracies. And that's what happened here.
And they got you with fear. Fear, we were discussing beforehand. Fear, yeah. Fear. Everything that has been done has been done to focus on triggering that fear sensor, and to make your average person, in many cases, not think. They're just trying to react, and they are like, I don't know how to deal with COVID-19. What's the actual name for COVID? I don't even know, but I know I can trust these experts who have invested years of their lives, doing the research, right? I can trust these people because the media is saying I can trust these people. And to your point, Nick, it raises this fever across the world where people they can't enter into conversations in a rational way because they're so incensed, they're so on edge, and they're just prepared to do whatever they're told is going to keep them safe next because of that uncertainty. So now we're a year removed from really when COVID started to be a thing, and we have more definitive evidence that just reaffirms really what we've been saying from the beginning. So as you were going through and we were, discussing your presentation in this new video that just went out and, just taking the internet by storm there, let's kind of outline some of the things that were common myths that we heard. And I think one of the things that has really, and you discussed it beforehand, that's really been a big mind switch for a lot of people is this belief that a healthy person's default setting is possibly a danger, is possibly sick. And this notion that asymptomatic people are a risk to society, not only we knew was a bunch of baloney, but now we have definitive data backing that up. Nick, could you dig into that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Brian, to focus on that one, because it is the lie that underpins the entire false narrative. Without the doctrine of asymptomatic transmission being a driver of the epidemic, lockdowns don't make sense. Universal mask wearing doesn't make sense. Even universal vaccination. I mean, there are lots of reasons why that doesn't make sense. But and I'm not saying that I'm not an anti-vax person. I think vaccinations that are safe and effective are a godsend for vulnerable people. But the idea that we need to be jabbing children and infants with an experimental drug that is only 1/3 of the way through its trial process is immoral in the extreme. I mean, anybody who can't see that is one of these people who's gone mad with the fear, or stands to make a huge profit,
right?
By jabbing those kids. Really, there's no need to vaccinate anybody under the age of, depending on where you are in the world, 50 or 60. I mean, maybe in poorer countries, you can drop the age limit a little bit. But for somebody my age who's in good health, I'd much rather be exposed to coronavirus than to the vaccine, because there's and this is something maybe worth just drilling into a little bit.
No, for sure.
Because it's not covered in the presentation. We just didn't have time. We wanted to keep it under half an hour. This whole story of the variants, the mutations, is another fear-mongering tool. And the reason I can say that with quite a lot of force is when you sit down and talk to immunologists who are not corrupted by conflicts of interest and so on, what they will explain to you is that the human immune system produces a very broad response to a viral attack. So I'm not saying the virus is a straight line, but if you think of the virus as a straight line, as a spectrum, a long string of genetic code, which is presented in the form of proteins, those genes code the manufacture of proteins, okay? What's happening is when your immune system gets hold of the first example that it sees, it chops up that long string and teaches your immune system to recognize this piece and this piece and this piece. Those are called epitopes. And in a very interesting paper produced by in La Jolla, out west in the United States, that was released probably a month ago, they actually went and counted the epitopal responses. And what they found is that the average person produces 17 different responses. So in the event that there is a mutation, or even 2 or 3 mutations, you might knock out 1, maybe 2 of those epitopes, but your immune system can still recognize 15 of them on average. And for some people, the number is like 40, And so your natural immune response is completely able to deal with the virus should you be reinfected. And reinfection is not a terrible, frightening thing. Reinfection is the method by which your immune system is challenged. Would not be surprising to find that certain people who've had the disease and recovered get reinfected with the virus. What would be surprising is if they get sick a second time. That's very rare. So these variants, which are supposedly the variants of concern, the Darth Vader voice you have to have on when you talk about the variants of concern, they're not a concern from the perspective of evading natural immunity. And now comes this question, are there a concern in terms of evading the vaccines?
Right.
And in this regard, it's a very interesting story because on one level, the narrative, the gated narrative has to be that vaccines work. And so you can't make too much of a scene about the variants evading the vaccines. But on the other hand, if you can leave the story on the side and bring it up in about 3 months' time, then I can sell you some new vaccines. Okay? So there's this emergent story that's being almost imported into the narrative by these kind of marginal scientists like, what's his name? Geert van der Bosch, okay? Who has a video that's gone viral. It's all over there. Nobody's shutting it down. He's basically saying that the vaccines are going to cause an absolute disaster, that it's going to bypass our innate immune systems and everybody's going to die, okay? Now, why is that little media item being accepted? Because what it's doing is, while that story grows, we'll vaccinate everybody, and then we'll say, oh, look, that guy was right. We need to bring in a new vaccine and give everybody a vaccine all over again and make another $15 billion of profit or whatever the number is. It's probably well north of that. So there's this story of the variants. And the story of whether they evade vaccines is in itself interesting because those spike proteins that that a lot of the vaccines feature. That's what they've done is they take one fairly long portion of the virus and they go and teach your immune system that portion. And that's how the vaccine produces the immune response. Now that spike protein is long. It's got like 12,000 genes on it. And genes is the wrong term. But anyway, broadly speaking, it's long. And you get so you might get 42 different epitopes that out of 67 or whatever it is that the human body recognizes, focusing on the spike protein. And so a mutation in the spike protein also wouldn't cause the vaccine to be evaded. There's no question that vaccine immunity is narrower than natural immunity. And so there again, you've just got to listen to the conflicted scientists who are trying so hard to say that vaccine immunity is going to be better than natural immunity. That's nonsense. You won't be able to demonstrate that, even if it was the case, and it's unlikely to be so for decades.
Right.
It's not something you can demonstrate now, and it's very, very unlikely. So that's a marker. If you hear a scientist saying that, you got to assume they're bullshitters. In the pocket of big pharma. So yeah, the variance issue is right now being used to stoke up fear and to provoke people to continue wearing masks and locking down and all these crazy things that are so desperately harmful and so totally unhelpful. And it's just getting to the point of ridiculousness.
And your team at PANDA, so you can say this with extreme confidence because your team is so diverse. I mean, you have people formerly from the pharmaceutical industry. You have people from, the immunologists. You mentioned the list of types of, epidemiologists, immunologists. Goodness, Dr. Scott Atlas, he's one of your advisors for the, for PANDA. And you guys are...
Kuldorf, Bhattacharya, Gupta, Bhakti. These are great names. These are people who, with publication lists and citations and awards that just go on and on and on. I mean, they make the rest of us look like complete monkeys, but and so when I publish something, an article in a newspaper or something like that, it goes on to the Google Docs, and it's the most intimidating thing because the next thing that happens is the 4 or 5 designated scientists out of the 100 or whatever all come crawling into the Google Doc and start tearing it apart, So by the time I pump something out, I'm very confident that nobody's going to say to me, well, that's misinformation,
Yeah.
Because that's the problem is, we're always under the spotlight in a way that, the media puts us under the spotlight, but they never put the damn health professionals under the spotlight. And they speak nonsense all the time,
Yeah.
absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
And so they get a free pass. We get scrutinized. Okay. But we just lift our game. We make sure that it's all scientifically correct. And so we published an article on the variants, for example, a couple of weeks ago, that's been very well received, and tells the story, lays the story out in plain English so that a layman, an intelligent layman can understand it,
Yeah.
Yeah. So I speak not as an expert, but as a person who is subject to I was going to use the word discipline. I suppose it is discipline in a way, but more I have access to the input of a lot of very, very bright people.
Yeah. And I guess, because we are kind of doing this behind the scenes reaction to your video, and you're seeing there's a lot of people who I think are starting to maybe say, oh, maybe the past year's narrative, maybe it wasn't correct.
Yeah.
But there's still a strong, fervent group of people who firmly believe that not only has the course of action that we've been taking been the right course of action, but the reason that it has been the right course of action has been the what ifs, we didn't know what could happen, right? So to those folks, Nick, I mean, how can we win those people over? I mean, is there winning them over?
I think there's a minority of people who you'll never win over. They will go to their graves believing that every element of the policy response, of the mask squaring, of the perspex dividers, of the silly stickers on the floor was absolutely warranted, very effective, and saved us all from dying. I think you will never convert those people, and I never think of them as being in our kind of target market. But I think there are a lot of people in the middle ground for whom, some of this stuff is starting to look a little ridiculous now. They're starting to say, well, wait a second. You said to us that when we got vaccinated, we'd get our lives back,
Yeah.
And now you're telling us we're going to have to wear these silly masks for, until 2025 was one of the claims made by a public health person in the UK, I'm smelling a rat, And it was very interesting when this presentation was unusual for me because I gave it in front of a live audience, as in real time, but also as in people, real human beings in
real
the
people,
flesh, sitting in a hall. Yeah. And it was really interesting because there was I could see the emotional reaction. There were people in the audience taking off their masks midway through the presentation. You could see, it was like the scales falling from their eyes, And then afterwards, when the whole thing had finished, because I was the first slot in the morning and there were a couple more presentations, it took me 5 hours to get back to my hotel room. And there was this very interesting thing that was happening. There were people who were like incredibly emotional, shaking almost, crying in tears, and coming and telling me their stories, what had happened to them, during lockdown. And it was interesting because a certain part of that audience already heard our story and they were almost there to hear it again. That was a sort of a people who are part of our fan club. Okay. And they were not emotional because for them, this is all just making complete sense. But it was the people who came in and maybe hadn't heard of us or who were a little bit skeptical about us. They were the ones who had the strong emotional reaction because they sit back and think about it. Wait a second. How much have I lost here? What does this all cost me? And it was, you're telling me it's all for nothing. And when I listened to your presentation, I believe you. Those people just wanted to cry. And it had a big effect on me because it's the first time I've been in that kind of situation. And so for a few days afterwards, I was actually battling to deal with all the stories that I'd heard. And it was a completely unexpected reaction for me, and one that I've never experienced in any environment ever before. Yeah, I think the last person to leave my presence was at 3:00 in the morning. It caused a very cathartic kind of process. And it worries me a little bit, because I think there's a whole world, or half a world, because most countries out in Asia and in the rest of Africa didn't do these crazy things. But safely more than half of the world has gone through exactly the process, and more than half the people in those countries bought into the false narrative and went along with the malarkey because they believed that they were saving people. They were doing a good thing. It was their goodness that was being exploited here. And I think when those people turn, and they will turn, it's a certainty. You can't maintain such an elaborate lie for much longer than a year. To call much longer than now, really, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I think, I don't mean to interrupt your thought, but I think that there, that might be part of why this hasn't stopped, because it would require those people in positions of power to do the unthinkable, and that is to say, we were wrong. And they will never do that. I look in my home state of New York, seeing someone like Andrew Cuomo to this day still standing by his nursing home policy. We just saw Rachel Levine get appointed to one of the top health positions here in the United States from Pennsylvania, who pulled their mother out of the nursing home before they implemented their nursing home policy that killed the thousands of seniors in nursing homes. So it would require people to effectively say, not only did we do the wrong policy, but also I guess our policy did end up causing more death than we said it wasn't going to. And I don't know about you, Nick. This is something I heard from the very beginning, is that, you just want people to die. You don't care. You're so dangerous. Your ideas are just going to put more people at risk. And now we're seeing the exact opposite. You showed me your slide presentation beforehand. What was the number? 15 million people, was it? Expected for starvation across the world this year? It was something like that. I think the numbers are going to be out of this world.
Order of magnitude, I'm afraid. Yeah.
It's going to be insane.
I hear what you're saying, but I tell you where I think there's a little bit of subtlety that's maybe worth picking out.
Please.
What you say is correct, that I don't think the people who have been the face of all of these things will ever step down naturally. But what will happen is they will be thrown under the bus.
Yes.
You've already seen it a little bit with Cuomo. When their political parties or backers realize that the winds are turning and that they're going to need scapegoats, and they're going to need, basically what they've done is they've used them as useful idiots, and they will now be treated exactly like the useful idiots of the regimes of Stalin and Mao, lined up against a wall and shot. I'm not saying they should be shot. I mean that proverbially, they will be thrown under the bus. And so the Faucis and the Drostens and the Cuomos and, you can just carry on. The list of names is obviously as long as you care to make it. But those people will be discarded by the power players, who will try to say, this is a scandal. You advised me to do this, and you showed me this forecast, and you, and they will blame. And in an effort to maintain political power, So I think that's how it'll play out.
Yeah.
Now, that will be a completely insincere game. But hey, welcome to politics.
There it is.
Nothing new under the sun.
Because you mentioned him. We haven't talked about him yet. Dr. Fauci. Good old Dr. Fauci. He has been propped up for the past year as pretty much the best doctor ever in the United States. But he's been on record, saying one thing and then saying the other, complete opposite position months later, or found saying it years earlier. So I'm just curious, you're speaking to a lot of folks in the greater scientific community, in the epidemiologist, immunologist community. What's the perception of Dr. Fauci? Do they look at him as someone who's actually following any science, or is he at this point just a political player?
No, they look at him as a complete charlatan, a liar, and a fraud. Is just nobody in the community of independent scientists who thinks that guy has anything sensible to say at this time about the epidemic. They all were pretty impressed with his March paper, because very early on, he and Redfield wrote a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine where they concluded, and it's in the presentation, that the impact of coronavirus would be more or less in line with the severe seasonal influenza, which it has been. It's exactly what it has been, And you get people saying, oh, it's the worst epidemic since the 1918 Spanish influenza, Well, yes and no. And don't say that without also saying that the population mortality rate is 1/60th of that epidemic. 1/60th, not 1/6,
right?
So yeah, it's been a severe seasonal flu. Probably, you can have the argument: is it better or was it lighter or heavier than the 57-58 epidemic? But it's not, it's not way out of whack with other seasonal respiratory virus epidemics that have been, bad ones. Okay, so yes, people did die. Would we have preferred not to have had this? Of course, yes, we would prefer to have managed it better than we did. But this is not the Spanish flu by any stretch of the imagination. And what he did was in January, February, and March, he summarized the science pretty well, saying, in the history of respiratory viruses, there's never been a situation where asymptomatic people were drivers of the epidemic. That's correct, and it's still correct to this day. He said, there's no point wearing surgical masks in the general population, let alone cloth ones, He says the impact is going to be in line with the seasonal influenza. And he writes that spectacular paper with Redfield, who's the other chief panic officer in cahoots with him. And then suddenly, sometime in April, his brain switches. And I think unless we get people onto witness stands to find out what caused him to switch, you will never find out, because there was certainly no emerging evidence. The emerging evidence in the time frame around the end of the first quarter last year and the beginning of the second quarter all endorsed his original viewpoint, and the one that we've been beating the drum about since then. That the World Health Organization's original estimates of mortality were out by an order of magnitude, that all of the modelers were way out, that the potential benefits of lockdown were greatly overestimated. Everything that we've been saying is bang in line with the science up until about February of last year. And then all those scientists go completely batshit crazy, Fauci and Redfield included, and Ferguson and Jostin and Vila and all these, fiends. They all go crazy and take the world with them. And I want to know, I want to see those people on witness stands so we can understand what went on. Because it's not simply the case that because Bruce Aylward came back from a one-week trip to China and said, the Chinese lockdown seems to have worked, that the world locked down. There was much more to it than that. And I think a very interesting thing is that a lot of the features of these lockdowns, even though they contradicted all the guidelines, were very much in line with the thinking that was presented in the Agenda 201 presentation that I spoke about also around October 2019, where these people sit down and have a mock pandemic exercise where they lay out something that contradicts all the guidelines.
Wow. It's unfortunate. I don't know about a better word to say. Because, we've been saying this for a year, Nick, and this is why it's like sometimes there's a meme it perfectly encapsulates, I'm in the greater liberty movement. It's like what your family thinks we do versus what we actually do. And it's like, what I actually do is smash my head against the table, because we've been saying this stuff for a year and quite literally could have prevented so many millions of lost lives, so many millions of lost productivity years in the future if just we didn't react the way we did. If we had not taken, basically marching orders from China, from how to handle, air quotes, big on the air quotes on the word handle, the pandemic by doing these very authoritarian lockdowns, we could have prevented so much mass starvation, mass joblessness, mass depression, drug use, despair. We're seeing it all skyrocket. So it drives me crazy that we could have had this been avoided. But your focus on the topic at hand has been, well, now it's time to reopen society, right? Like now we're focusing on, I guess, the light at the end of the tunnel. And you're mentioning, we're seeing it. Places are opening up, the narratives are falling. So what are some things we can look forward to as we are approaching this proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, this very crazy past year and a half?
Yeah, look, I mean, the bright spots have obviously been the states like Texas and Florida and Arizona that have been opening up. I mean, some of them, you can really say South Dakota stayed open. No particular calamity there. But kind of story as manifested in North Dakota, just showing once again that these measures were broadly unhelpful, but very harmful. So I think those states, we owe them all a great deal of appreciation and thanks, because they have already shown that it is completely unnecessary to go through these charades of social distancing, lockdowns, and masks. And they're all just complete nonsense, absolutely without basis in science and the data. And look, everything's fine there. And of course, there's the test cases of Sweden and Japan, which didn't lock down at all, and countries like Taiwan and South Korea, where, it's maybe not a right to use them as examples because they sit in the middle of a region where there, broadly speaking, wasn't a pandemic. The mortality rates for Africa, Asia, and Oceania from COVID are 100 per million, which is that's about 1% of their annual deaths. It's nothing. So, and that's below the level of, what a normal flu season would do.
And why is that, Nick? I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought. Is there a reason in particular those areas were just completely missed?
Yeah, because the science has been so distorted by the rabid madness. The basic studies that would answer those questions haven't been done. If I was in New Zealand, I would have said, well, this is very interesting. The disease made landfall in New Zealand. It's highly contagious. Why didn't it spread? Now, of course, what happens is the scientists there, it's the best lockdown and the border closure, and they pat themselves on the back and they're contact tracing and all this nonsense. Okay. What I would have said is, okay, maybe, but let's just go and do a serology test to see if we've already got antibodies. And even if that doesn't show up anything, let's do a T-cell test. Let's go and take a substantial cross-section of our population, a few thousand people, and see whether there is pre-existing immunity to this disease. Because now there are dozens of papers showing the mechanisms and the extent of pre-existing immunity. And in some of the populations in which it's measured, it's estimated at upwards of 80%.
Wow.
Of people, And why is this the case? It's not an unexpected thing. It's not at all surprising. And SARS-CoV-2 is so closely related to SARS-CoV-1 that it doesn't even really merit a distinct name. That was kind of a little bit of a marketing exercise. This is a rose by any other name. It should really just be called SARS, a variant of SARS. Okay? And so it's not a new virus. It's an individuum of the beta coronavirus known as SARS-CoV. Okay? So, and even more than that, that virus, SARS-CoV, is very closely related to 4 viruses that circulate generally in the human population. And remember I gave the story of the long string and how the human immune system recognizes lots of parts of that virus. Well, if your virus is 96.5% the same as HCOV, which circulates as a seasonal cold, guess what? A whole lot of people would have seen this thing fairly recently and their immune systems will recognize it and they'll deal with it fine. That's where you get the so-called asymptomatic cases. It's a completely bogus term for them. What you should call them is those are the healthy people who, when they get exposed to the virus, have such a light reaction to it that they wouldn't notice that they'd had it unless you'd given them a damn PCR test, So, yeah, we have this situation where instead of doing antibody tests and T-cell tests in New Zealand and Australia, they've concluded that their lockdowns were just the best thing. I have a strong suspicion that if you went and did those tests in those populations, what you'd find is that there was never really a risk of those diseases breaking out in those territories. Why? Because they weren't the only 2 countries in the region. Some 70 other countries had similarly light experience. Some of them didn't lock down at all. Some of them don't even have the capacity to lock down. Right. Some of them are, desperately poor places that couldn't organize a contact tracing exercise if in a room of 2 people. That's pretty much what you're dealing with. 52 countries in Africa. I don't know how many countries there are in Asia, but it must be, I would guess, something in the region of 30, including the tiny ones. And so in none of those countries was there anything going on, yet the whole lockdown crowd go, oh, Australia, New Zealand, wonderful story. Look at how brilliant their lockdown was, Everything seen through the lens of one factor when we know that multiple factors influence outcomes, and that one of them, which is very noted in every study that's ever been done, is cross-immunity or pre-existing immunity,
And how about what we're seeing with people who are getting sick? And this is something that we're not talking about, and I don't know why nobody's talking about it. It's like 70% of the cases of mortality rate are people who are morbidly obese. Like, elephant in the room, no pun intended, but obesity rates, and we see this predominantly in America, especially in America, that's one of the leading causes. And then I'm like, hold on. So that's one of the leading causes, and yet we're going to go ahead and shut down all of the fitness centers because science?
So there's a lot to be untangled there, because the first important thing that's also not spoken about is that almost all the transmission, or let's not say almost all, the vast majority of transmission takes place in nosocomial settings, meaning in hospitals and nursing homes. Okay. Now, if you're morbidly obese, you're going to be making much more regular trips to the doctor or to hospital. Okay. And if transmission takes place in those environments, why? Because that's where you find the vulnerable people, the morbid people, the comorbid people, and the virus at high concentrations. So you take the vulnerable people and put them into a building where they're exposed to a high inoculum, and they get sick and die. Let's talk about that causal chain, Yes, coronavirus is involved in that causal chain. I'm not arguing that case. It should appear on the death certificate somewhere. But is that really what's the cause here?
Right.
And then even worse than that, you take somebody who's presented at the hospital with non-COVID symptoms. You run a very high cycle threshold PCR test and find a little virus had flitted across the nasal membranes, causes the test to trigger positive, bang, into the coronavirus ward. Clinically, that's a false positive. They're not at hospital because of their coronavirus. But if they're fortunate enough to leave hospital, they will have been infected.
Right.
Yeah. So you've got somebody who's arriving sick from something else being shoved into a coronavirus ward. And that is definitely, so the extent here of what are known as iatrogenic deaths, I think when the full analysis is in, you will find that as maybe even more than half of all the deaths that have been legitimate COVID deaths. I'm not talking about the misattributed deaths. I'm talking about the fraction of those that are legitimate deaths. I would guess that more than half of those have been iatrogenic deaths caused either by people being pushed into settings that are dangerous for them because of the PCR test, or by people being shoved onto ventilators because, they got COVID, or people being treated by doctors who are suffering from what we call COVID tunnel vision, where basically everything they see has to be squashed into a coronavirus box. I mean, I don't know what it's like in the United States, but in South Africa, we've heard of doctors writing down COVID pancreatitis on the death certificate. Somebody arrives at hospital with abdominal pain. They give them the admission test. Test is positive. Okay. COVID patient, everybody goes. All right. But he's got no COVID symptoms. Dies of pancreatitis, possibly because nobody knew what to do with him for the first 2 days while they were waiting for the test result. Okay. And then that's COVID pancreatitis. Now, that death will very often be, I think, an iatrogenic death, where the doctor is looking at this patient as if, wow, that's a strange manifestation of coronavirus,
Right.
And treating it in the wrong way. I think also people with bacterial co-infections who've not been treated with antibiotics because they're being treated as if they've only got a viral infection, all sorts of things like this will turn out to have been the case. The panic has definitely been much, much worse than the actual true epidemic, which I think has been actually reasonably contained.
Then,
and that's the other thing that's worth saying. When I said that this is maybe as bad as the 57-58 flu, I think it's only been that bad because of the panic response.
Yeah, and that led perfectly into my next question, and that is, we've seen this happen before. It's happening now. How can we help prevent this in the future? And I think that maybe is a great way to as we're getting ready to focus towards the end of the episode, is we know what works. We know what doesn't work. So I'll say, Nick, when we're setting policy going forward, we're seeing there's going to be long-term ramifications for sure. We're going to be feeling it, but how can we make sure that we set this in place so this never happens again? Because this is just absolute insanity.
Yeah. So to that, you've got to do a root cause analysis. And unfortunately, some of the roots of this particular mania are very, very deep. And so maybe let's go through the easier ones first, work backwards in time to, from the more recent roots to the older ones, because the more recent ones I think are easier. So, I think the one thing that needs to happen is that in countries that have constitutions, you need to make amendments to those constitutions to rule out this kind of action. I've become pretty convinced that there's no set of circumstances where lockdowns are warranted, where the termination of democratic process is warranted in the face of a disease. Why? Because if there really is a deadly disease going around, people will manage their own risks. I don't know if you remember the Chinese propaganda videos of the falling men, and there was that classic thing. Now we all know that was garbage, because nobody's gone around falling over. This is not how you get this disease. Causes you to get progressively tighter in the chest, in terms of you're running into breathing problems. You're becoming hypoxic. It takes some time, and you arrive at hospital in a certain amount of distress. You don't just, you're walking down the street quite fine, and then the next moment you've dropped down dead. This is not how the disease works. So we know that was all just propaganda by the Chinese Communist Party, spread about the world by a host of human bots. That's something else that has to be investigated. How the hell did we suddenly have thousands of people in every country in the world ready to receive and proselytize this Chinese propaganda? That's a very interesting thing, and you need to look at the work that Michael Sen has been doing in that regard, because it's almost spooky, ridiculous. So you have to look at the constitutions and say, okay, let's work out ways to make this kind of action illegal. And there are countries in the world where it was: Finland, Sweden, Malawi. Not many, but a few countries where the governments either tried or didn't even bother trying because they knew that there would be no legal basis for it. So make lockdowns impossible legally would be a good step, but it's not going to be possible everywhere. Some countries don't have constitutions, and the governments can do what they want, and they rely on the law courts to interpret what they've done. And, even in England, where there's a very strong common law tradition, the courts have been basically neutered, it completely emasculated, and haven't done the right thing once. So you can't really rely on the institutions to function properly when everybody's driven into panic. More important than that, I think we need to look at ways to decentralize all these organizations, because the problem with centralization is it destroys the means of error correction. And that's, in my mind, destruction of the means of error correction is actually the greatest sin in the world. Okay? If error correction is what enables us not only to course correct, but to learn. It's fundamental to knowledge creation and economic growth and alleviation of poverty and any good thing you can name. So terminating the means of error correction is the greatest evil. And error correction is not possible in heavily centralized environments. They believe their own bullshit very quickly. They set up gated institutional narratives, and the World Health Organization is just, it's, we've got some insiders who talk to us, which they're not allowed to do. They sign contracts, and it's crazy shit, man. What goes on in there in terms of they almost get taught a double speak language.
Really?
Yeah, it's just phenomenal. And so there's a certain way of talking around the elephants in the room, But wait a second, we haven't done a cost-benefit analysis on lockdown. You've got to be able to talk your way around that elephant. How do you do it? How do you never, ever once recommend to countries that before you implement a lockdown, you should do a cost-benefit analysis? You're the World Health Organization. You do burden of disease calculations for a living, How is it that you don't make that statement? Okay. So we've got to look politically at ways to decentralize these organizations at better. And then the other thing is we've gotten lax on maintaining independence and monitoring conflicts of interest. All of these guys at the universities and at the public health institutions are completely corrupted by their funding, which comes from the World Health Organization, the Gates Foundation, Gavi, and related parties. And so, yeah, fine. Okay. If there's going to be corporate funding of research programs, that's all right. But then don't have those guys making decisions about which vaccine to use, or who gets the vaccine, or whether to lock down a bit more, or whether to ban a promising cheap drug. These people are all deeply conflicted. So you've got to maybe create some rules around that to monitor and manage the conflicts. But then I'm afraid the deeper problem, which I think this is a manifestation of, is a multi-decadal slide in education. We have allowed this kind of radical skepticism. It's the spawn of a very postmodern view of the world to creep into the organizations that educate our youth. And according to that view of the world, there is no reality. Opinion is what's more important. Your place in a power structure, your place in a hierarchy. And you can see this, coming out to play now. When you go and confront these guys with something that offends the narrative and you show them some data, they don't come back at you with data of their own and have an intellectual debate. They try and cancel you. They try and have you kicked out of social media, or LinkedIn or YouTube or whatever. They try and shout you down. That comes from that kind of radical skepticism, the postmodern view of the world. And it has to be undone, or we must just abandon those institutions of higher learning and start new ones, because they truly have bred the most incapable, inept, and absolutely painful generation of kids. I don't care if they can be 50, they're still kids, because they just do not know the first thing about how to confront problems, how to create explanations for complex phenomena, and how to engage in debate with people who are trying to do that as well. And so for me, that is just something that has hit me like a bucket full of iced water, that the time is up for those institutions. We have to count out now and stop this radical administrative creep and the onward march of these crazy theories like critical theory and endless number of wokeisms that invade the academy and even, as it turns out, stretch into the STEM subjects.
Yeah, well, we need to almost crowdsource alternatives. I mean, I have a good friend of my show here, Corey DeAngelis. He works focusing on school choice options in the United States, getting kids just alternative solutions to the education system. And I think we need to do that more into the higher ed, right? We need to start, instead of saying, okay, just because you have a degree from name the Ivy League university here, and that makes you instantly a qualified candidate. No, let's actually have you go through, working in almost like crowdsource kind of a way with certain people who are focused on certain topics that, hey, maybe you're particularly passionate about. You get really, really good at those things, and then we collaborate. Then we learn from each other instead of just saying, oh, I have my degree and, well, you just have to trust me. And, oh, by the way, the funding that I have that can go to whatever project I want, I'm going to have that project, obviously yield a result that's going to, push policy that we can then put into action. And then we can, who was? Oh, who it was? It was Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro mentioned back when he went to, I think it was Harvard, how he was in the law school, the amphitheater. And at the time, it was Elena Kagan, who is now a Supreme Court Justice in the United States Supreme Court. And she was the intro law professor saying, you are, to the collective class, the future of America. You're making the policy. And just because you're leaving this institution with a degree from Harvard, you are instantly going to be the top of society. And that's the mentality. That's the way that a lot of people think. It's not a matter of what you're actually learning. It's not a matter of what ideas you're testing, but rather the degree, where it's from. Who did you know in terms of, being able to get these connections. So I'm hopeful that people are going to start waking up from this, Nick. So how about this? As we do focus towards the end of the show, I want to make sure we're pointing folks towards PANDA, but you're raising your finger. You have a point to make. Go ahead, make your point.
Yeah, I think that kind of thinking is exactly what is going to be required. We're going to need different ways of signaling reliable knowledge and understanding, other than university degrees. Because I think, as you correctly point out, you can kind of get by virtue of your GPA and your family connections, you can make it into a top school, come out with a degree, and that tells the person something about you. There's been some kind of selection process on the way in, but it doesn't really these days count for much on the way out, because you've got the potential for somebody to graduate from a Harvard or a Yale with their head full of nonsense, and nothing really that's of use in the real world, of practical use. In fact, I think a lot of the time those educations will make it impossible almost for you to be useful. If you believe the stuff that they've taught you, you're not going to be building the next spaceship to Mars. Sorry, it'll crash. I'm sorry. So it's good for the gender studies wah-wah segment of the HR department of Amazon or Google. You can get a job there, okay? But you're not going to be doing anything useful to man or beast. And that, I think, is a problem that is going to, it's going to have a market solution.
It has to.
Smaller entrepreneurial firms have got no interest hiring those people, and they're going to start looking for other ways to signify or signal quality, to test quality.
Always. Well, hey, you mentioned your team is growing over at PANDA. So how about this? We want to make sure that folks who do want to get more involved, but also just want to learn more about PANDA, which is the Pandemic Data and Analytics, they can go ahead and find and learn more. So Nick, where can folks go ahead and do that?
So the starting point would be our website, www.pandata.org. There's a little process of if people want to join as active members, which is the requirement for that is that they have, sufficient independence and time on their hands to actually contribute to the organization. It's not a social club. It's not a form of social media. We do look for people who can actually do some work and who want to end the madness. But there'd be a little bit of an introduction process and then an induction process, and that will include introducing them to the members in their own countries and their own fields worldwide and so on. So we're always keen to hear from such people who can help us. The organization has grown to the extent that we now need to put in place a permanent executive. The people who run the organization, with the exception of 3 full-time people, are part-time volunteers. So I have a day job. I'm an investor. I run a fund. I have a responsibility to those investors. I also have reached the limit of my managerial abilities. I'm not a manager, So we've come to the point where we need to hire a full-time executive, and that takes funding. And we have been the very grateful beneficiaries of some generous crowdfunding support. We want to maintain our independence from corporates and institutions. So we are going to be running a bit of a campaign on crowdfunding. And I think this is of the work we're doing is of global importance. And so any support in that regard would be greatly appreciated. We need to, raise a couple of $1 million in order to put that executive structure in place so that the good science work done by all these wonderful volunteers can be, pulled into the mainstream and explained to the intelligent layman. And that's where we're heading for. So the starting point is, the presentation and hearing this. Move on to the website, pandata.org. You can also follow our Twitter and Facebook handles, which are in both cases, it's at Pandata19, PANDATA19. I'm on Twitter, and my handle is at Nick Hudson CT for Cape Town. So yeah, those are the ways to get in touch. And we're, true to our word, true to our philosophy. We totally embrace innovation, the world of conjecture and criticism. So we don't only want to hear from people who agree with us,
Nick Hudson, we could go on forever, but unfortunately, I know you have an interview coming up on your end as well. So, hey, thank you so much for spending some time with us today, and thank you for all the hard work you're doing over at Panda. We'll make sure we include the link to the amazing new video, Time to Reopen Society. And again, folks, you have to make sure you watch that before. Obviously, they made it through the entire episode. I hope they listened to the video beforehand. But otherwise, folks, share that episode or that video with folks out there. It's very important that we spread the message of truly what's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic. Nick Hudson, thank you for joining the Brian Nichols Show.
Thank you, Brian. Bye-bye.
Get ready to start your new morning ritual with our new sponsor, Mudwater. Coffee is one of America's favorite beverages, with more and more people starting their coffee habits every day with a cup of that flavorful anxiety juice. But let's be real. Have you ever heard anyone say, I'm working on getting more coffee into my life? Millions of people complain about the jitters that come from coffee consumption. Our morning coffee rituals can be habit-forming, and for some people, can make getting a good night's sleep almost impossible. And while nearly all of us like the smell, taste, and ritual of our morning coffee, why not explore eliminating the negative aspects of our morning brew? Well, what if your coffee replacement helped induce alertness, not dependency, improve mental capacity and function, improve physical stamina and performance, improve immunity and overall health? Oh, and by the way, it tastes good enough to drink every single day. Meet Mudwater. Mudwater is your fastest growing coffee alternative in the market, consisting of organic ingredients lauded by cultures both old and young for their health and performance benefits. With 1/7 the caffeine of coffee, Mud gives you the natural energy and focus you expect from coffee, but without the jitters and crash. With an organic blend of mushrooms and ingredients like cacao, marsala chai, turmeric, lion's mane, and more, Mudwater offers a beverage like no other. Whether you want to enjoy it hot, cold, as a latte, or however you take your coffee in the morning, Mudwater is the zero sugar, zero crash, zero jitter alternative, sure to leave you feeling recharged and refocused. Listen, I'm really excited to have Mudwater as a sponsor here on the Brian Nichols Show because I've been able to see the Mudwater difference for myself, and you can too. So click the link in the show notes to get some mud, support the show, and get your new morning ritual started right with Mudwater. Alrighty, folks, that's going to wrap up my conversation with Nick Hudson from Panda. What a topical conversation. And honestly, I didn't expect to air this episode today, but it just was one of those things where it's like, yep, this works. I mean, it's perfectly timed. And the fact that, his amazing video here, The Ugly Truth About Lockdowns is it's not just reaching people that it needs to reach, but it's having an impact. And that was something that he shared. It really did hit me. People staying until 3 a.m. talking about their lockdown experience. How did it impact them? And I would love to hear that myself. So do me a solid. I'm going to leave you guys with a call to action. I'll have a few. But first, I want you to email me, brian@briannicholsshow.com, with your lockdown story. What was your experience during the lockdown? Did you lose a job? Did you experience financial hardship? Whatever it may have been, I'd love to hear your story. So email me, brian@briannicholsshow.com. Number one. Number two, if you enjoyed today's episode, when you share it, please do me a solid and tag myself, and you can tag me at bnicholsliberty, Twitter, Facebook, minds.com, and parlor.com, but also make sure you tag Nick and Panda. I will include the social media links in the show notes. Number three, if you could do me a solid, head over to Apple Podcasts. If you enjoyed today's episode and you enjoy what you're doing here at The Brian Nichols Show, a 5-star rating and review, I would greatly appreciate that. And hey, we just gave you a fun random bonus episode on a Saturday, which, I mean, this is a fantastic conversation to be had. So thank you to Nick Hudson for joining us here on the show today. And thank you to the member of the audience for helping us continue to pump out 3, 4, 5 episodes per week. Because, hey, you guys keep downloading it and you guys keep on getting a lot of value. So we'll keep on doing that here at The Brian Nichols Show, because our goal is to what? Yeah, you know the drill. Educate, enlighten, and inform. So that being said, it's Brian Nichols signing off here on The Brian Nichols Show for Nick Hudson. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.
Audio production for The Brian Nichols Show is brought to you by DB Podcast Audio. Learn more by emailing inquiries to william@dbpodaudio.com.